You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. Ladies and gentlemen, there are ladies, things that makes it official. For 16 years, we've been bringing the Chris Voss Show with over 2,000 episodes to share with you and enlighten you and brighten you with the Chris Voss Show glow so that you can wander around your universe and understand what's going on. The one thing man can learn from his history is man never learns from his history. So that's why we're going to talk about stuff that hopefully we'll finally learn from. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss1 on the TikTokity, and all those crazy places on the internet. Today we have an amazing young man on the show. We're going to be talking about his newest book. Jerry Huerta is on the show with us today. His book is entitled Thy Kingdom Come, Reevaluating the Historicist Interpretation of the Revelation. Out January 4th, 2022. Based in Tucson, Marsue and Jerry Huerta have dedicated countless years to rigorous study of the various interpretations of the book of Revelation. Their commitment to understanding and interpreting these ancient texts has culminated in this significant publication. Through their extensive research and thoughtful analysis, they bring the vivid imagery and narration of Revelation to life, presenting it in a way that resonates with current era and reaffirms the Protestant historicist interpretation. They were driven to write Thy Kingdom Come due to the perceived shortcomings in existing schools of eschatology, which often fall short in interpreting the four horsemen of the apocalypse, I'm the fourth, and placing them accurately within historical context. Their quest for deeper understanding led them to explore and ultimately share their findings through this book. Welcome to the show. How are you, Jerry?
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for welcoming me.
Is it true that I'm the fourth horseman? Is that in the book of Revelations? The Chris Voss Show is the fourth horseman? I don't know if it's true or not.
Are you deaf?
I might be. I have COVID right now. I could just be comatose, and I just don't know it, and I'm talking to myself. So, Jerry, give us .coms, where you want people to find out more about you on the internet.
The .com is the historicist.net. You can find that on, of course, yeah, that's my website name. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then give us a 30,000 overview in your words of what's in your new book.
The book is about the book of Revelation. It's actually taking the historicist point of view and analyzing and making some reevaluations on the way they place the seven seals, the book of Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and basically reasserting that some of the principles in interpreting the book.
And you bring the story to, I guess, semi-modern day, where you put it in kind of, would you call it a parable maybe for the new story, or how would you describe that?
It's just an evaluation of the narration and the symbolism and how to place it.
Okay.
Okay.
What led you to write the book? What was the inspiration?
The inspiration goes back to, I think, how a lot of people, and particularly if they're raised in a Christian household, they see that the Bible is presented to them, the Bible stories, so on and so forth. And the book of Revelation is probably the one that's most fascinating, or it could be the most scariest to some people. I guess some people shy away from it, but I didn't shy away from it. It fascinated me from the very onset. The imagery, the symbols, the story, the darkness and the light of it always, brought my attention to it. And that's very early on in my Christian walk is when I really started delving into it and getting on the internet. I mean, later on, I did get on the internet and started debating the issues about how it's to be interpreted, and that's how I got to end up writing the book, because I remember someone said sarcastically, it said, "You ought to write a book." So that's what actually led me to write the book.
They wanted it, you gave it to them. Now, why do you feel that Revelations need a better interpretation, maybe more descriptive interpretation? What makes your interpretation different than maybe other past interpretations either?
It's different, but it's not. It's still mainstream. I mean, it's mainstream historicism. Now, what I do is I do build on their foundation, and what I build is either going to be rejected or accepted. That's what it says in the book, is that all our works are going to be tested at the end time. And if we are entering certainly into some difficult times for the Christian church, our ideas and our concepts are going to be tested. Okay, It's like I said, it's from a mainstream perspective. It is, and if there's anything different about it, is in how to place those seals in time. And are we supposed to be looking for this narration and symbolism in the seven seals in time? I do believe that, unlike the other points of view in the mainstream of Christianity, there is a definite place, timing that we can look for them. And my book brings it out. We should be looking for these events during our time, modern times. And I really bring out that imagery in that. And the keys that unlock that, one of the keys being the Hebraic cultic calendar and its festivals.
Now, what is the Hebraic festival? How do those relate to your thesis?
The Hebraic festivals are the Hebraic calendar. They're festivals divided up between the fall and the spring festivals, spring coming first, of course. And it's analogized to the planting. There is an imagery Christ makes in one of his parables about how the sower of the good seed, and he sows the good seed in the world. That's quote, the kingdom of God. He calls that the kingdom of God. Now, that is a takeoff on those festivals. There was a spring festivals in which there was a planting, and they represented the time of Christ's first advent. There was 4 different oblations that were occurring right there, and he fulfills them. They were foreshadowing certain events in the plan of salvation that would occur at his first advent. Now, the fall festival, some 7 months later, were to depict his return and the judgment that would occur at that time. And there are certain oblations, and there was a lot of symbolism, and that symbolism foreshadowed what he's going to do when he returns. So that those Hebraic festivals that in the calendar are really comprised of 2 events: the spring, representing Christ's first advent, and the fall ones representing his return. That is a template that can be used for interpreting the book of Revelation.
So tell us a little bit about your history. How did you grow up? What got you into the field of religion? What were some of your influences? And then right up to writing the book.
There isn't a lot of influences other than my curiosity and debating these issues on when the internet came into existence, debating these issues. As I said, my background is just strictly layman. I am a layman, but I take off on the priesthood of the believers, which is where Protestantism commenced. Now, the priesthood of the believers is the belief that we are responsible for understanding and the scriptures and knowing them and understanding them. And I took that challenge from a Protestant perspective of the priesthood of the believer, and decided that as everyone that's a Christian has that responsibility then to understand the scriptures, and if he feels that something is not quite right in the body of Christ, that is his responsibility to voice those criticisms or admonitions, and that's what led me to write the book.
And so now people can kind of get. Do you feel like it's maybe easier to digest in the interpretation you put it in for people to understand Revelations?
Yeah, especially because I do take the Hebraic festivals and use them as a template in opening the book. When we should actually, what that template does is tells us when we should start looking for these certain events that are narrated and symbolized in the book of Revelation. The 7 churches, there's 7 churches. There's actually 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 plagues in the book. And the significance of the churches, 7 churches, is there was supposed to be 7 months in between the spring and the fall festivals. Now, they were a foreshadow then of those 7 churches. And those 7 churches are not just historical churches that in Asia Minor at the time of Christ. They are also represent 7 eras between the 2 advents of Christ. When you read the 7 churches, you will see that they reflect the history of the church. And expositors began to see that probably at the time of the Protestants were rising, and started realizing that those 7 churches did represent 7 eras in the church. Certainly the Laodicean church, the final one, represents this period that we're living in, because it is a church that thinks they're rich and increased with goods. That's our market day driven society that rose along with the merchants. And that's evidence that those churches do actually reflect the certain times and periods of the history between the 2 advents of Christ.
So with prophets, how do they have relevance in your thesis?
The prophets provide the symbolism, the interpretation of the symbolism, and and as I said, the prophets also use themselves the pattern in the Hebraic culture to understand how these events are supposed to work out. Now, the prophets understood that there was going to be a final and a high judgment at the end of the time. And it was supposed to be on that 7th month. Now, if the churches represent or were foreshadowed by those 7 months in between the spring and fall festivals, then the last one is going to have to represent the time in which that final judgment occurs. Now, the seals are indicative of that judgment. So we should be looking for the fulfillment of the seals during the time of that final church. And so we should be looking to match the symbolism and the narration of those seals, and particularly the 4 horsemen, for events that are happening in our time.
So with the 4 horsemen, explain people maybe who aren't aware what the 4 horsemen are or need a reminder. What do they represent?
That's the value of looking to the prophets. The prophets understood that horsemen or the final judgment was supposed to be comprised of trial upon his people, and his people are the church today. That is exemplified by God sending their enemies against them to cause them great distress. And the prophets used the symbol of the locust to represent that trial against them. And the locust had the appearance of horsemen. The locusts have the appearance of horsemen, and that's what we see in reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Okay? Those horsemen represent the trial that's going to go upon his church, be upon a trial that's moved upon his church in order to refine them and prepare them for the final events when Christ returns. Those horsemen and the narration of them is what we should be looking for and reconciling it to history during then our time, because we are in the final church phase. The fact that I said that the description of the final church, that it thinks it has some great material wealth that fulfills everything they need in life. And that epitomizes the church today, being that we are in this market-driven society. It has imbibed a lot of those ideas that happiness comes from materialism. And that's the ethos or the spirit of this church today. So we should be looking for what those 4 horsemen exemplify in our time, in our society.
Next question for you. How did the rise of Protestantism change modern society?
That's kind of like jumping ahead here, but let me just say, kind of define those horsemen and why we should be looking for them in the time of our society. Then the first horse is said to subjugate. It goes forth and conquers. So we should be looking for some entity that goes forth and subjugates people in the final day, in our time, not in the final day, our time, which are the final days, our time. And then because of that subjugation, the red horse then appears. It invokes an idea of war. There's wars that occur when this first rider appears. It goes forth to conquer, and it creates warfare, as conquerors do. Okay. And then the next horse, the black horse, exemplifies or invokes images of economic commotions. Okay. It states there's prices of wheat, prices of barley that create hardships, because in the very next verse it says, but do not hurt the oil and the wine. So in essence, the setting of these prices of the barley and the wheat cause these economic commotions, hardships. And the fact that the horse is dark or black represents there's something unjust there. Balances are also in the imagery of the black horse. So there's economic upheavals that are occurring during these times too. The wars, economic upheavals, and this concept of conquest are all mixed together and coming forth we should be looking for those events in our time. And then all these commotions come down to the fourth horse rider, which you called yourself earlier. And that fourth horse rider represents death. All these commotions end up calling death by the sword and by famines. Now, what could be looked at as fulfilling all that imagery and all that narration is the rise of Protestantism. Protestantism went forth to conquer. And wherever the exploits of Protestant missionary occurred, so did imperialism and colonialism follow. Mm. Now that's his historical fact that I bring out for a great deal of documentation in my books. And I'm working on my second one right now. Those commotions of war are caused by the fact that Protestants changed society, secularized society, and along with the rise of the merchants, then that caused the rise of the merchants to follow. And so as Protestant missionary imperialism went out, so did the rise of colonialism and the increase of wars. The nations became conscious of the self, that they could become rich by cornering the markets on the resources, and that's what colonialism is all about. And by cornering the markets of attempting to corner the markets in those resources, they created wars. Oh. And they also created these economic upheavals like the Great Depressions, the recessions. All these things are exemplified in the rider of the black horse. Our economic disparities between the rich and the poor, all these things we're facing in modern times that have never existed in the history of the world to this extent. There's been wars in the past, but not like the wars in our century, the First and Second World War over the resources of the world. And all this commenced with the rise of Protestantism by changing the place of the church in society. It secularized society and caused the merchants of the earth to rise. And all this competition over resources and wealth have occurred since then. Oh. And there's been no greater amount of death by the sword than in those two First and Second World Wars. Yeah. So what I'm saying in my book is that the four horsemen have been riding forth since the time of the rise of Protestantism. Now, along with the rise of Protestantism, it wouldn't have been acceptable for these things to occur, except that Protestantism also broke away from the church and the tyranny of the papacy and its corruption of society. And it created a situation where Protestant also led to a lot of good things, like the Republican forms of government, the freedoms and liberties that we have today. Mm-hmm. But there was, as in every good thing that rises and is as a movement by God, then the arch deceiver comes along and tries to spoil it. And that's what he did. There was factions within Protestantism that really pushed society to the far left in secularism. And that's how the other emulations arose, these commotions arose. The imperialism and colonialism that also followed Protestantism. The wars for the resources of the world followed also. And then the economic depressions, recessions, and commotions that occurred because they set prices, not by righteous means or having the church having some sort of part in the running of government. They took the church out and they created social conventions to determine how the economy should be run. And the greatest disparities between the rich and the poor have occurred because of that.
Wow. The other question I had for you, there's something about the four horsemen and merchants, and I think you may have talked about that already, mixed into with what we've been discussing. Is that correct?
Yes, as I said, with the rise of Protestantism, they changed society. They took the church out of every aspect of the government and the running of the state. And then that allowed the merchants to rise. Now the church is said to there's going to be a great falling away prophesied in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be at the end times. Once again, that's during the time of the Laodicean church, or the final events that lead to the judgment of God. Now, the church in its apostasy then is, in the book of Revelation then, is likened to Babylon. And Babylon has this part in causing the merchants of the earth to become rich and increased with goods themselves. See? So there's this tie-in between the rich merchants and Babylon, but knowing Babylon is the apostate part of the church and the final days, they have a collusion together. And that collusion is in the fact that Protestantism secularized society, which allowed the merchants to rise.
Oh. So in the end, as we wrap up...
Go ahead.
In the end, as we wrap up, what is the end benefit that many people can come away with after reading your book and understanding what Revelations is about? Okay,
the end benefits. First of all, it goes back to the responsibilities of the priesthood and the believer. That unless we come back to some traditional points of understanding what the responsibility of the believer is, then this is what led to the situation that we find ourselves into today with the rise of the merchants and the riding forth of the four horsemen. Mm-hmm. Apostate Protestantism being the situation that we're in right now, because in particular, there is some documentation that I'm going to be presenting, especially in my second book, of the place of the evangelicals in this. They divorce themselves, or basically set aside the traditional importance of theology, mm-hmm. and for an emotional or personal experience with Christ. But without theology and going back to our foundations and having a good understanding of what has developed so far as what the church and theology is all about, this is why these things are happening today. So that's the importance of knowing Revelation, because it starts bringing out these aspects in our lives. Certainly, the book says there's a blessing to be derived by keeping what is written in the book. How can you keep what is written in the book unless you understand and know what is in the book and how it works out in our lives? Okay. Yep. And most important is knowing the change of the mindset that has occurred because of the rise of the merchants. Mm-hmm. This rich and increased with goods is a self-sufficiency. It's a self-interest ethos that we have today. That has touched everybody, not just the people in the church, but it's telling you that the church has been conformed to the world because they do have this ethos of self-interest above the common good. Mm. In the past church, the Protestants, when it first rose, it lifted up the importance of the common good over self-interest, because that's what the gospel is all about. We're admonished to put ourselves beneath what is family, our self-interest below what our interest for the family, for our communities, and for the believers in general. Where our mind has been changed in our contemporary times to accept an ethos of self-interest and selfishness. Oh. And that has been the big part in bringing down the church. It's in essence, the great falling away of the end time. Whoa. When the common good is not the priority of the church and its members any longer.
Wow. Vanity, my favorite sin.
Vanity, exactly.
Final wrap up, tell people where they can pick up your book and order up where fine books are sold and your .coms.
Yeah, it's any place that Amazon, you can get it online in any place that sells book. It's all over the place right now. A lot of bookstores. And it's thehistoricist.org is where you can find my website. And There's a lot of information. And I also have a blog, The Historicist. It's through the Google, The Historicist. You can look that up and have a blog, and I have a lot of this information on there.
Thank you very much for coming on, Jerry. We really appreciate it. It's been very insightful, and I know a lot of people are into this, and maybe they can get a better understanding of it thanks to your book.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And order the book wherever fine books are sold, folks. It's called Thy Kingdom Come, Reevaluating the Historicist Interpretation of the Revelation, out January 4th, 2022. Thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss 1, the TikTokity, all those crazy places on the internet. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time. And that's